Great. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Vicki Baars. I'm the Head of Culture Transformation at Culture Shift. And for those that don't know Culture Shift or are new to us, or any of our online events, we're a tech for good organisation. We believe in a future world of work and study that is safe, happy and supportive for everyone, everywhere. We do this by using our software and services to empower organisations to tackle harassment, bullying of all kinds. We allow leaders to activate positive change in their organisations and maintain the cultures that they want. Culture Shift's software currently helps over 90 organisations protect over 1.8 million people. It transforms the way that organisations listen to their people, foster the sense of belonging that we all genuinely desire, and actively identifies, tracks, addresses, and helps to prevent incidents of harassment and bullying. We've recently started partnering with NHS trusts, and we therefore want to use this platform today to talk about these issues, and more importantly, to share best practice, gather insights, and think about how we can move past just conversations and take it into actions that can make the NHS a happier and more sustainable place to work. So I'm really glad to be joined today by Simon Fleming. Simon is a trainee. Hi, Simon. I can do a little intro for you now, that awkward part where I talk about you. So Simon is a trainee trauma and orthopaedic surgeon based in London. He has a national and growing international reputation for his campaigning work to drive up standards in medical education and drive out bullying in the NHS and other healthcare organisations. His #HammerItOut campaign is inspiring others to challenge the status quo and stamp out bullying, harassment and discriminatory behaviour in the NHS. Supported by the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges and the Royal College of Surgeons and others, he aspires to create positive culture, better for staff, patients and the NHS. And before we begin our discussion with Simon, I'm just going to give a little bit more context about why we're hosting this event today. So from our experience, the term culture transformation is often seen as a bit of a buzzword, but in reality, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in order to see the seismic shifts that are needed. The first being taking responsibility and accountability for what hasn't worked and the change in the past that we've desperately needed to improve the cultures in the NHS and associated organisations nationally. According to the 2021 NHS staff survey, 18% of staff had experienced bullying and harassment by a colleague or a manager. So 18% of 600,000 survey respondents is 108,000 employees. That's a huge number of people experiencing these issues. And the dial hasn't really changed. It's either stayed the same or got worse over the last 5 consecutive years. And our recent survey at Culture Shift found that 42% of people left their jobs due to toxic workplace culture. There are currently 40,000 vacancies within the NHS, and clearly more needs to be done to prevent bullying and harassment in order to transform the cultures of these workplaces. So without further ado, let's get cracking, asking Simon some questions. We want to hear all about what you've been up to, Simon. So let's start with an easy one. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and what you do?
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. And yeah, it is pretty cringe being introduced. It's like listening to someone reading out your dating profile or something. It's just like, oh my God. So yeah, I'm a trainee orthopaedic surgeon. I've been a trainee for a very long time by choice because I keep doing exciting things rather than cracking on with my training. And without turning this into like family therapy, I was basically raised by parents who were immigrants. So my dad was, and my mum's parents were, and dad was a Holocaust survivor. So through perhaps a paternalistic lens, dad would talk a lot about, you know, how it's the job of people with power to protect those that don't have it and that sort of thing. And that was kind of a reflection of what he went through when he was younger. And as with all these things, it's only when you're older that you reflect on the impact those sorts of like throwaway comments have on you. But you know, throughout medical school and throughout my undergrad training, there would be these moments often that I was present for, or even I was going to use the word complicit in, but part of you know, jokes that I made, jokes that I laughed at, where I would feel shame or guilt or anger or disgust. And I now kind of recognize them for what they are, which is moral injury. It was me trying to fit in a way that went against my core values, but you know, I'm human. I wanted to fit in. I wanted to be part of whatever group I was in at the time, whether it was medical students or surgeons or whatever. And then as my training went on, more and more, I became more self-aware and more aware of what was going on around me, where I was like, there is something just not quite right about the world I inhabit. And I started to realize what it was when I could put my finger on it, which was these bullying behaviors. Because I've never liked bullies. The first fight I ever got into when I was like 5 was because I saw a kid picking on another kid, and I just walked over and was like, that's not nice. And kind of harassment and discriminatory behaviors and undermining, just, you know, where people make people feel awful. And so I got the opportunity quite early on in my training to get involved in trainee surgeon politics. And one of the things that then became very apparent to me was just how much privilege not only I have, but those around me have, and how blind many of us are / were to that. So we would sit in a room and I would be, in this context, advocating, and I do the air quotes because at the time it was a flavor of advocacy, but it came from privilege. Right. So we were sat in these rooms and I'm going, well, orthopedic surgeons want this and orthopedic surgeons want that. And the pushback from the General Medical Council or from a college or whoever was always, well, that's what you think. How do you know what a queer person of color with 2 kids wants? And I would say, well, you know, we've got reps and I speak to people. And it's like, again, it's a step away from like, well, one of my friends is like, it's that kind of narrative. Mm-hmm. Actually, we went away and we reflected in a way that was quite surprising of like, do we know what we're talking about? Like, we're calling ourselves a representative organization, and we did work very hard to have link people and regional reps and all the rest of it. It was like, do we know what we're talking about? Because at the time, you alluded to the kind of NHS staff survey, which is you know, the data from the staff survey is a dumpster fire, especially if you extrapolate that most of the behaviors you and I are talking about are underreported. So the data in that survey is by definition very generous.
Yeah, 18% of people who, you know, would think something is serious enough to warrant being called bullying and harassment. But yeah, there's a lot of more benign everyday things that won't get captured there. Yeah,
it takes a huge amount of bravery just to click that button. Mm-hmm. And so we did, and so for trainees, the other thing we have is something called the GMC survey. So the GMC survey is something that all junior doctors are encouraged to do, and it's a wonderful example of the kind of inbuilt hierarchy and power dynamics, which is what most of the stuff we're talking about is. It's power in one flavor or another. So the GMC survey is not mandatory. You don't have to fill it out, and yet they get over a 95% completion rate because it's implied that though it's not mandatory, it will be noted if you don't do it. Just noted. You make your own choices. You don't have to do it, but as the professional regulator, you know. Anyway, also interestingly, their section on bullying, harassment, undermining, discrimination, all of that sort of stuff is not anonymous, and it makes it really clear that this is an anonymous survey unless you want to raise concerns. And then you give up your anonymity. And generally, the first thing that happens with that information is it's given to your direct supervisor, who, of course, 99 times out of 100 is the person you're reporting. So that at the time was the only data set. So we decided to do something called the BOTA, British Orthopaedic Trainee Association, my organization, census. And at the time I was vice president, and we were writing it and designing it, and the team were putting it together, and they were looking at, you know, demographics and how far do you have to travel for work and career aspirations. And I was like, can we ask some questions about culture? And everyone was like, what? And you've got to remember, this is 2014-15 when we're designing this. Unashamedly, nobody was talking about this. It wasn't on anyone's radar. None of the conversations that have dominated healthcare for the last 5 to 10 years really were happening And I was like, yeah, there's something like at the back of my brain, like in that lizard bit of my brain that tells me we're missing something. And everyone was like, look, if that's the hill you want to die on, go for it, knock yourself out. So I put some questions in, and they were really pretty straightforward, which was, in the last 4 weeks, have you experienced bullying, undermining, harassment, or discrimination? And then, have you ever witnessed it? And the data aligned very much with the rest of the data, which is, you know, anywhere from 6 to 10% of people said that they had experienced it. And yet, 60, 70, 80% of people were saying that they'd seen it, because no one likes to be a victim, but it's everywhere, right? It doesn't happen to me, but it happens to everyone else. And then, as is the way of these things, we normally as an organization are allowed to present this data. Every year we do a little project, and this was my project. This was my hill to die on, right? So at our big national conference, where all the consultants and the like are also attending, my colleague presents all the demographic data, this is how far I have to travel, this is where I want to live when I grow up, all that sort of stuff. And then he hands me the mic, he walks off stage. I walk to the front of stage, I look out to a couple of hundred orthopedic surgeons, and I say, I'm a bully. I make people feel small and worthless. I've probably broken the law. Statistically, most of you are the same, and we have to do better.
Wow.
And in my head, I then went on, I presented loads of the data, and in my head, the way it was going to end was like a movie, like someone was going to stand up and start doing a slow clap, and then someone else was going to start another, and then everyone was going to stand up. I was going to get a standing ovation and be like carried out on their shoulders.
And how did it actually go?
Everyone lost their mind. Like everyone lost their mind. It was a mixture of like, this doesn't happen in my rotation, you're a liar, I want to see your raw data, I demand to know who said this about me and my
Pure defensiveness by the sounds of it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I knew that was coming, and the reason I knew that was coming is because A, human beings are human beings, and B, similar work was happening parallel in Australia. They were literally doing the same thing. They had an event that tipped them into it. So for those who don't know, basically a vascular surgeon in Australia wrote an article talking about the sexual harassment she had experienced during her time as a trainee. And she said that the fact that she had said no probably held her career back, and sometimes she wished she'd just said yes. And so that was Australia's event.
Yeah.
But that, for me, that day where we presented that was where it all started for me, because in my head, this was going to be a little passion project that was going to take up, a year of my life, 18 months of my life. And instead, it's been my life since then.
So is that where the Hammer It Out campaign came from, that data in particular? Yeah.
Yeah. So
tell us a bit more about that.
So a big part of the campaign was we needed data. So when we put that survey out, we started it with a little like a cover letter that we sent to everyone that was like, number one, we will protect your anonymity even at the expense of our own careers. This is our written commitment to never share your identity with anyone. And I promise you, I have had explicit threats to my career, and I'm like, let's go. They still do it now today. Like all the stuff I do, people come at me and I'm like, I dare you. And part of that, again, is my privilege. And part of that is a choice I made of like, live your values. Like if it was easy, everyone would do it. But the other commitment we made to everyone when we put this survey out was, we promise to act on whatever you tell us. And the joke I always said was, if all the feedback we get is, we hate you all, quit, we will. But of course, the data that really came out was that we had this toxic culture in orthopedics. And so literally that afternoon, we had a sit down meeting as a committee. We were like, right, well, I guess that's my mandate, because at this stage I had just become president of the organization. I was like, that's my mandate for the next 18 months. Like, that's what I'm going to work on. And so we decided that we had we had no budget, but we had a social media platform and we had a platform nationally, and we were going to. And so my vision was, we don't have the power to necessarily write policy at that level, because we didn't at the time. To quote Hamilton, I wasn't always in the room where it happened. But we did have an ability to raise awareness and make people talk about it. And my theory was, once you take certain things out of the box, once you shine a light on them, they can't be unlit. You can't stop talking about them. So I committed myself, basically for a year, 18 months, to just making as much noise as I could, but not just noise. It was focused, it was clear. I had an idea in my head of what the messaging was going to be. I read about kind of Kotter's change model, and it talks about like building a sense of urgency. So it was like, here is the data, here is the quantitative and qualitative data that demonstrates we have a problem. I'm telling you, you have a problem. So you now can't pretend to not know. You can no longer claim ignorance. You can no longer say, well, this is a shock to me, because I'm telling you, and I'm telling you in a really public forum, i.e. social media. So you can't pretend like you lost the email or weren't paying attention in the meeting.
Yeah.
And then we, Hammer It Out was a great example of culture, because we wanted something that was funny, kind of self-deprecating a little bit. So the whole Hammer orthopedics thing kind of resonated, but we wanted it to feel active, like you're doing something. It's not a passive thing. Culture change doesn't just wash over you. True advocacy is a choice. You have to make a decision to do a thing. But when we first started, I was so surprised. I thought I was pushing against an open door.
Found out it was very closed all of a sudden. And I think I really like the I just wondering if the Hammer It Out part was a play on surgeons' tools. So I'm glad you answered that. And I'd just quite like to move us on to maybe talking a bit about, you were invited to give a TED talk, and I'd really love to hear a little bit more about how that came about and what you spoke about in it. So
the TED thing's really interesting, because I was nominated by someone. I still don't know who. So there's TED. TED has TEDx, which are these. They're all still part of the TED family, but they're normally either geographical or organizational. So TEDx NHS is TED Talks given by people who either work in or are involved in some way. So patients and carers and the likes. Anyone who has a story to tell about the NHS, basically. And it's really interesting, because part of the TED brand is you are coached and curated, which I found really difficult, because up until that point, I had been doing lots of talks that medics are sort of used to giving, lots of kind of by PowerPoint. And
here's the data, here's the proof,
right?
That sort of stuff.
And I'm a natural storyteller. Like, those who know me will know that I will talk all day without a break, just because. But I'd never been shown before how to make it into an effective story, rather than just like a rambling old man shouts at clouds type story. And so they really curate you. They're like, this is how you start, this is how you finish, this is how you have a golden thread. And my TED talk, which is available, you can Google it, it forces you to take everything you want to tell people and turn it into an 8 to 12 minute story. And so my TED talk talks about the beginning of the kind of Hammer It Out campaign morphing into why should we change? Like, why does it matter? Because people do get defensive. So I talk about, both in the TED talk and in other talks I've given since, I talk about the challenges we face of coming to terms with the fact that culture just moves on. It's an iterative thing. Like, if you're involved in culture change, you've got a job for life, because in 10 years time, someone will go, well, that's not how it is now. And if you have a growth mindset, you go, oh, bugger, I was just getting comfortable with the way we were doing it last time. All right, tell me about this new thing. And the classic example is my mum, who used to work in finance, used to be hit at school. In fact, back in the day, you chose the school that hit kids the most. Like that was the best school. And now we know better. And it's the same with drink driving, and it's the same with wearing seatbelts, and it's the same with all of these sort of big systems culture change, rather than the personal internalized culture change. Is everyone's like, no, but this is how it's done, and it went well, and it didn't do me any harm, and it made me the man I am today, and all that sort of narrative where you're like, yeah, and we're not trying to take that away from you. We're not saying you're bad. You know, there's that great quote from Maya Angelou, which is, do the best you can till you know better, but once you know better, do better.
Yeah.
Like no one's going to hold you accountable for not knowing any better. There's an expectation you should educate yourself and all the rest, but the point is, once you know better,
right?
Yeah, once you know better, you then do sort of have no excuse not to be a little bit better. You can't then go, oh, I didn't know that I should wear a seatbelt.
I really liked what you said in the talk about tectonic plates. And I think, like, you know, we've talked about that big sort of eruption moment of like this big set of data that you've got. But like that's, you know, kind of the small shifts that are going on and not really understanding the stuff that's moving beneath your feet. And thinking about that, I guess, we've obviously got quite a few people on the call who it's their job to sort of do the small everyday incremental changes that hopefully do feel like large scale culture transformation when you look back maybe 5-10 years, but it doesn't feel like it like immediately. So I guess from your experience, what do you think needs to be done to retain staff and to stop them from leaving due to bullying, racism or incivility?
I mean, that's a nice, easy question. Just like, how do we fix staff retention in healthcare? There are some really, right. There are some really big answers, which I always say are really obvious, and then they're often not obvious to people. So a little bit of respect goes a long way. Now, respect isn't the same as being nice. And I think niceness, I don't think, I know there's papers on it. Niceness can be as toxic as bullying, right? I don't have to like you. I don't have to be lovely to you, but I do need to respect you and treat you with respect. Whereas niceness, the metaphor I use is, you know, Vicky, if you had food in your teeth, right? A nice person wouldn't tell you because it would hurt your feelings and it would just be mortifying. Whereas someone who respects you, whether they like you or not, is going to, with respect, let you know you've got food in your teeth. They know that you're going to be mortified. Right. They know that you're going to be mortified, and they know that you're going to think about it for a day or two, and they know that it's going to play on your mind. Oh my God, what did people think? But respect goes so far. It goes such a long way. It's about creating a sense of belonging, and that's belonging is like the end point of diversity and inclusion. Is, you know, you don't really have belonging until you feel empowered to question things. And that takes a lot of work to build that, because, you know, diversity is good and inclusivity is good. But it's only when you have a sense of belonging that you can go, actually, I disagree. And that's the bit that a lot of patriarchal and hierarchical systems actively try to stop, because it causes disruption to the status quo. It unbalances things. And it is possible to have a zero tolerance policy and not be awful. So a lot of zero tolerance policies, both in healthcare and in the world, are actually not zero tolerance policies. What they are is blame-based policies, where someone does something and the system is designed to burn them at the stake, or the system is designed to ignore it because the system requires them for whatever it is they do. And what we really need to do is demonstrate, so it all needs to be explicit, that you have a system in place whereby all behaviours are held to some level of accountability, but that the system ideally encourages change and growth. So the challenge we have is that a lot of these behaviours that we're talking about, the low-hanging fruit is expel them, fire them, report them to the chief exec. And that's all well and good, and that's lovely. And
That's also a really high bar as well, isn't it? Like, I think that's why a lot of things don't get reported, because if it doesn't meet, like, if they don't feel it's serious enough to be entering into like formal disciplinary action, then what's the point if that's the only option, right? Whereas, like, I think what you're saying, addressing things more incrementally, helping people to grow and be better, is something that, like, a lot of organizations notice as a company like that in their kind of having it in their arsenal, basically.
And you're right, and it's because previous attempts at healthcare culture change, and I say this as someone who's been at it for a while, and a big part of what I've done has been to try and learn from others' mistakes, which are absolutely everywhere. Previous attempts at culture change have been puritanical. We expect you to be flawless and perfect human beings and never say anything wrong and never do anything wrong and never upset anyone. And if you do, well, then so begins the witch hunt. And if you look at models like the Vanderbilt cup of coffee model, it allows for you to screw up, and it allows for you to make mistakes and say the wrong thing, because it does happen. And it's not about why it happens. Oh, we're stressed. Oh, we're tired, because that's a separate conversation around recruitment and retention, things like fatigue and sleep spaces and food and drink, like, you know, basic human needs, Maslow hierarchy stuff that, again, healthcare generally gets wrong. But the Vanderbilt cup of coffee is a great example. So again, you can Google it. It's all the way out there. And what they say is most people do well just with feedback. Hey, Vicki, you had a really good day today. Or Vicki, you know, and I know that you didn't have a great day today. We can talk about that if you'd like. No harm, no foul. But say you and I are working together, and say you drop something, and when you bend over to pick it up, I say, while you're down there, ugh. I would never say that, by the way. But
say yourself in your mouth.
Right, say you say that. So the Vanderbilt model talks about that being a single unprofessional incident, and they talk about an informal cup of coffee conversation. So either you have it with me or someone else has it with me. So you can have peer-to-peer, or you can have someone else in the power structure. But their evidence suggests that if you have an informal reflective conversation with someone, over 90% of people will change their behavior. They'll hate it, right? It's the food in the teeth thing. I might roll my eyes. I might call you a snowflake and tell you you've got no sense of humor and, oh, millennials nowadays and all the rest. And then you change your behavior. But it allows for growth, right? There's no email chain. I've not been reported to the chief exec. But then their model talks about, say I do it again the next week. So then you've got an apparent pattern. And so they talk about having an awareness intervention. So that is the same meeting, either with you or with someone higher up in my power structure, but it is in an office. There is an email trail, but it's still like a, Simon, can we talk about these behaviors? We know there's been an informal chat. We need to explain why we'd like you to change. These are our core values. This is some evidence on the harm that those behaviors do to patients, or how much money it costs our business, or whatever it is. But this is why we'd like you to change. And this is how we might support you. Do you need some help? Do you need some courses? Maybe this is new to you for whatever reason. Say I do it again. That's what they call a pattern persisting. And then you have and I love this phrase, a guided intervention by authority, which is a very polite way of saying your chief exec, your medical director sits you down and goes, stop it or else. I know that you've had an informal chat. I know you've had a formal chat. And I know that you are aware why this is the line. Stop it. And then the tip of the pyramid, if you like, is you getting fired or you being sent on gardening leave. And the nice bit about that model, because this is generally where people's hands fly up when this is face-to-face, is that it says there are obviously certain behaviors that skip certain steps. So I say obviously, but I do this work and I know it's not obvious to some people. If I sexually assault you, it's not cup of coffee chat time, right? Of course not.
Straight to senior leader conversation.
Right, because yeah. But to bring it to answer your question, having systems like that in place and having people see that you have it and you use it, it makes it a safe space to make mistakes. Which,
do you think that anywhere's doing that currently?
Some places are
doing it well.
Doing it well, no.
Okay.
But some places are. But again, it's part of it is because it's new to so many places. That idea of of growth and accountability, that idea of learning and change, but there being a hard endpoint for certain behaviors. So trigger warning, I guess, for those listening, I do a lot of work in the sexual harassment, sexual assault and rape space within healthcare, and it has blown my mind how many places don't have no framework of reference for what to do, and they will tell you that they do, and then you go, talk me through it, and they go, well, basically you have to speak to HR. And I'm like, okay, let's talk to HR, let's see what they say. And HR are like, and again, I'm like, this isn't a blame conversation. I'm not, who am I, right? I'm not firing anyone or speaking to the Daily Mail later. Like, what would you do if someone said something to you? And again, the problem is so many of these systems are so scary to people because it does take a bit more time. It's a lot easier to just ignore something or fire someone than spend an hour in an office with someone going, can we unpack why you made that joke or why you made that joke again?
You kind of started alluding to it there, and that was one of my next questions actually, was around sort of what do you think NHS people, leaders, chief exec officers, HR colleagues, diversity and inclusion teams, we've got quite a lot of those people on the call today. How do you think they can drive change and shift current cultures away from causing harm? So like, we don't think they're quite as equipped as they could be, or maybe their teams aren't as equipped as they could be, maybe they don't have the experience in dealing with these things because they're not well implemented, or they're like, you know, they've got the theory but it's struggling to apply it, perhaps. Like, what do you think the sort of the kind of steps are for people to support this sort of big cultural change?
I would ask them to be courageous. Recently I gave a talk about speaking truth to power, and there's some stuff in Harvard Business Review around being courageously competent or competently courageous. The stuff we're asking our colleagues in NHS leadership, with a capital L, I guess, to do is brave stuff. And there are some trusts who are trying to do that because it's about living your values. It's about holding people to account, whether it's for the little things or the big things, and demonstrating that it is okay to make mistakes and okay to have conversations about that, so long as you then develop and grow and change. A recent friend of mine who's an NHS leader in the north of England sent me a message on Twitter, and he was like, well, I've had my first cup of coffee chat today and I did not enjoy that at all. And I was like, you're right. And he was like, yeah, I was just mortified that no one had told me sooner. And so I think part of it is about having these systems in place, embedding them in your organization and being really explicit about it. I think it's about demonstrating that you're willing to have these uncomfortable conversations, whether that's about the culture in your organization or why certain things in your organization don't work. And we're not very good at that. We're not very good at saying, look, we have freedom to speak up guardians, but no one knows who they are. Or we have a freedom to speak up guardian, but because they are from this directorate, we know that they aren't really comfortable reporting people in their own directorate. And this is what we're doing about it. Like, everyone knows these things are happening, but it's a brave thing to stand up and say, we recognize that there are these problems, and how can we do something about it? How can we change it? I think that courageousness starts by admitting there's a problem. And again, a lot of organizations don't want to be seen to admit that they have a problem with their culture, but all the data tells us that everyone has it. I do not believe a trust or a directorate or a specialty that say they don't have it, because we know that not to be true. And so it's better to go, we are going to look into this and we're going to do stuff about it. And then it's about involving stakeholders. So the other classic thing, and again, to use the sexual assault space, is people try and handle it in-house because it makes people's skin crawl. So they try and deal with it on the down low. And actually, the way to do it is to shine a big old spotlight on it, to bring stakeholders in, to bring in those voices that need amplifying and are normally ignored or silenced, and go, you tell us, you obviously you have to create a psychological safe space, but you tell us what we're missing, what you need, where are the problems, and we will demonstrate to you that we're going to make some change. And it is accepting, and medics hate this, healthcare hate this, that the stuff we're talking about is that tectonic stuff. It's going to be marginal gains, and you're not going to see big change for 5 to 10 years. It's going to be lots of little wins, which you therefore need to point a big old spotlight at and go, we've introduced an anonymous reporting hotline. Not as one of the colleges did. They said, oh, we've got a hotline for people who experience these awful things. And the hotline was to a counselling service. And one of my friends who had experienced these things said, I don't want to call someone to be told how better to eat a shit sandwich. I'd rather just have something else for lunch. And so a big part of that organizational change has to be, these are the things we're doing to bring around change, and this is how we're going to demonstrate to you that they're working. Or, and this is the bit that's scary for the NHS in particular, we are going to be brave enough to go, this isn't working. We're going to do something different, or we're going to change, which again isn't how the NHS works, because it's such a behemoth of an organization in terms of change management.
And in our experience, like, victim survivors, which we hear from, work with a lot, want to see that demonstrable change. That's often the most important thing for them. Is not, obviously everyone has their own personal healing journey when they've experienced trauma, but we hear a lot from our users of report and support that actually what they want to see is that when they've reported something, it makes a difference. It stops that person from perpetrating again. It makes the organisation change. And so, yeah, I think what you're saying there is absolutely true, that people don't just want to be sort of sourced out to somewhere else. They want that information to be heard by people who can make a difference in their organisation. Another question I wanted to move on to was around, so the Messenger review happened after a number of damaging scandals hit the NHS. We see this time and time again, organisations don't tend to do anything until a scandal hits the press. The review suggested that leadership shake-up was needed to prevent bullying, harassment, and blame cultures. Do you think this is an appropriate action? Any other actions you think are necessary?
Yeah, and the leadership challenge is an interesting one, because without getting into current politics, the leadership starts pretty high up, and that does just filter down. And those leaders who are slightly closer to the grassroots are unsurprisingly under a huge amount of pressure. And again, not everyone appreciates that. Not everyone appreciates the pressure the chief executive is under and the power dynamics that they are exposed to, right? There's always a bigger fish. And I think the problem is that that healthcare in general, and the NHS in particular, still has a nearly vertical hierarchy. And because it has a nearly vertical hierarchy, and because of the way leadership roles are both advertised, assigned, all, like everything from how you get the job in the first place all the way through to how the job works and everything else, that really steep hierarchy makes it very hard not to have these behaviors, because these behaviors are all based and rooted in power. They're rooted in power and silence. And so when they say leadership change, it's not, as I think many people interpreted it, in a fire all those people and bring in new leaders. It's, we need to completely restructure how we run and do healthcare leadership. What does that look like? Who should be running this trust? Who should be running that project? The classic example, of course, being that I am a 39-year-old man with a international culture change shtick, but I'm a trainee. So what do I know? And that narrative sort of plays out. And other organizations, non-healthcare ones, whether it's the private sector or whether it's the military, are like, you've got all these people with this amazing experience and lived experience and skill sets, and you just keep them in their box at the bottom of the ladder because, oh, they don't have a particular title, or that role isn't even open to them. And so I think one of the big challenges is going to be, how do you bring the right people into the room without it feeling paternalistic or like benign sexism or benign whatever, how do you change the way we do things in healthcare? And again, that whole process of deconstructing and reconstructing healthcare hierarchy and healthcare power structures is the Australian word for it was a multi-generational piece of work, because it will take time, taking into account, right, the NHS is the fifth largest employer in the world and largest in Europe. It is not surprising that stuff will take time, but a big part of it is just the NHS is an organization that was designed by old straight white guys to help and further the careers of younger straight white guys. That's what the 1940s model was. And so it's not surprising that at a real core foundational level, it doesn't understand that you might want to work less than full time, or that you might want to work from home, or that you might both have children and also want to be in charge. It can't quite compute. And the classic example is junior doctors rotate every 4 to 6 months, and it is very common for junior doctors not to be paid, as in to not receive a salary. I've got friends in the military who are like, that doesn't make any sense to us. How can you just not pay people? But it's just accepted. The problem is it's just accepted. You ask most junior doctors and they've normalized it. They've drunk the Kool-Aid. They're like, that's just how it is. Sometimes you don't get paid.
And then how do you bring in people who can't afford to be supported elsewhere, right? It retains privilege in those spaces, absolutely. We've had a couple of comments and questions in the chat that I wanted to bring into the conversation next. I think that absolutely relevant. One of them was asking around if you had any tips for engaging senior clinicians. I mean, I'm sure like any EDI practitioners, HR colleagues on the call will also be thinking about, how they increase representation and diversify that, but it's the same story there in that that's going to be decades long change. I have a lot of experience working with higher education institutions, and it's taken them 15 years to see quite a big change in just the representation of specifically white women in senior positions. And now they're starting to look at that and go, okay, well, where's the intersectionality here? How are we bringing in people who aren't, just one step down on the ladder? And so, I guess in the meantime, while we're trying to change who is at the top, who has that influence and leadership in the organisation, and trying to diversify that, we still need to engage with the people who are already there. So have you got any tips for how to, help engage those people in this work?
There's part of it is being reflective enough to see where your leverage is, and part of it is looking at the people you want to engage and working out what their why is. And this, again, I think makes a lot of people involved in change kind of uncomfortable because it feels manipulative. And one of my friends said it's not manipulative, it's people management and marketing, which is kind of manipulative, but in a way of being quite self-aware. So one of the things I talk about rather when I speak to more senior leadership is I explore their whys, right? I demonstrate to them that what's a nice example? So I point out that bullying costs the NHS about £2.3 billion a year, and I asked them what they could do with say £500 million. What could yours trust do with £500 million? I demonstrate to them that, for example, we know that if I experience bullying, undermining, or harassment, I will there is evidence that I will spend up to 80% of my day stressing about it, thinking about it. Why did they say that? Why did that happen? What were they wondering about? We know that there'll be a 40% reduction in the quality of my work, a 50% in my time at work, right? So that's sick days, that's locums, that's bank shift. And we know that if I experience those behaviors, 25% of people who experience bullying, undermining, harassment, discrimination in the workplace take it out on patients. And then we know that the people who witness those behaviors, there's a 20% decrease in performance, a 50% decrease in their willingness to help others. So I can turn around to any chief exec and go, so whether you like it or not, even if you're a total sociopath, these behaviors are costing you money, like a lot of money, and they're getting you worse outcomes. You're getting less good proms, you're getting worse M&M data. Like, even if you don't care about the people who work in your organization, even if you think this is all woke millennial silliness, here's a reason why. And then, so there's always a lever depending on the people you're trying to engage in. And you know, unashamedly, I've had people reach out to me and go, I don't get it, but I can sense that it's the direction of travel. So just for a purely political reason, tell me how to engage. And so you need to know your leaders, and you need to lobby them to engage for whatever reason that is, because this is the direction of travel. This isn't going away. And actually, you know, it's taken a couple of years, but more and more the CQC are looking at culture. You look at mid-staffs, you look at the thing at Great Ormond Street, you look at Bristol. It's that first paragraph in every single one of those reviews was a toxic culture of. And I was like, how would you like to be featured in one of those reports? Or how would you like to hold your hands up and go, we've got some work to do?
Hard to hear actually a bit, Simon, I think, in terms of like kind of hitting them where, like speaking their language rather than hitting them with the moral obligation, which I think probably so many people listening in on this call are the people who like are here because they feel so strongly about the moral obligation. And I think you talked so much about your why, and that being so like morals led as well. But you're right, like I think we have to use all of the tools we have available to us, and if that is talking money to power to get like a means to an end, I think it opens doors at least, doesn't it? So that's a really helpful tip, thank you. There is another question, and something I wanted to pick up on. You mentioned it a little earlier as well around it's quite controversial to speak out against the NHS at this moment in time, and the issues that are within it. You talked a little bit about the backlash that you've experienced and maybe a bit about how you dealt with it, but if you'd like to tell us a bit more on that, that would be great. And we have a question that I think is very related to that as well that's come through, that's about sort of how do we protect the people who are holding big flashlights to these issues? I guess be that from the activists, campaigners, people who it's part of their professional role, or the whistleblowers. Like there's a whole range of people who are holding up these flashlights in different sizes and ways. But yeah, how do we protect those people, and how do we respond to backlash?
So part of it is just being mindful of your privilege. Like I am both an at-risk person for a variety of reasons, but also I have a bunch of privilege, and I recognize that, right? I am straight, I am white, I am male, I went to private school, I played rugby. Like I can't help how I look, who I love, where I went to school, but I can recognize that that gives me the ability, the privilege to work in that advocacy space. Now, the difficult bit is, and I alluded to it before, is that advocacy is a daily choice, right? You have to choose every day to live those values. And most of the time, the real way that an advocate advocates is by listening. Like the bit that most of my colleagues hate is that when I do talks on how to be an advocate, my first bit is like, shut up. The best thing you can do is to shut up. And when you're not shutting up, your work should be around amplifying voices. And a big part of that amplifying voices bit is how we link up with how we protect people who do this work, which is culture change and advocacy is very lonely. It's lonely work. And the closer you get to the pointy end, the lonelier it is. And the way you protect yourself from that is twofold. One, don't go alone. Don't go alone. Bring people with you. Have a community. Now, what that community looks like, whether it's the community of the people who work in your office, or the people who work in your trust, or the people who work in your specialty, or the NHS culture change community, of which, if you look on Twitter, there's a bunch of us, like, don't go alone. And the other bit is, and there's this quote, and it comes from a piece on rape culture, is who is heard and who is not heard maintains the status quo. So the status quo relies on the narrative of like, be quiet, keep it in house, shh, don't make a fuss. We'll talk about this, you know, don't worry, Vicki, you and I'll have a meeting after this offline. And a big part of how you protect yourself is actually by doing the opposite, of being like, I'm going to bring some people with me, or we are going to have this conversation, and we're going to do it out there, not on a soapbox kind of way, but these are the uncomfortable, brave conversations we want to have, and we want to have them in public, because then the things you do and say will also be in public. Now, don't get me wrong, there are still consequences. So I have had my career threatened. I have had my life threatened. I have been told that there are certain hospitals and cities that certain people have committed themselves to making sure I never work in. I am on a special register with the GMC because I'm at such a high risk of vexatious reporting. Now, when you look at the GMC's ethnicity and race data, if you consider that I'm at a high risk of vexatious reporting, the intersectionality aspect, if you are a person of color or a woman, you are by definition at a higher risk of all the things I'm describing. But again, a big part of it is don't go alone. Go take people along with you. The system, the status quo, the patriarchy in and of itself, but these power dynamics are designed to isolate and to wear you out, to tire you out, to make you just want to quit because you are burnt out and you are morally bereft. And the advantage of both not going alone and building a community who want the same thing as you is that when you're like, I can't, not today, I can't, I'm just so tired, is that someone else goes, don't worry, mate.
I've got this.
I've got this. I've got this. And that idea of, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together, really, really does hold water, because it means that you're never really alone. You're never really fighting those battles alone. And that's a huge part of it, I think, in terms of protecting yourself from those repercussions, but also recognizing that they're sort of unavoidable, which is why I talk about courageousness and why privilege and power and advocacy and allyship is so important, because a big part of the work I've done is bringing people who are far more influential and powerful along with me and being like, do you get it? Do you see why this is a thing? So all of a sudden, when you've got a Royal College doing a kind of inviting an external inquest into their diversity, that only took however many years to get them to do. But suddenly it's like, now you get it. Now, don't get me wrong, they could have gone further. They decided not to act on certain bits of the Kennedy report, but it's a step in the right direction. And so again, it's really hard now for them to go back on that because it was so public and so big. So a big part of it is about not being seen as that lone crusader, because then it's really easy to silence you and really easy to say, oh, that's Simon, he likes to stand outside and scream into the void, rather than, oh, that's the people pushing for culture change, and they are looking to bring around a learning culture. They are looking to raise awareness of this, that, and the other.
Yeah, I think power in numbers is what I'm hearing there, and it can be such a challenge when you feel kind of overwhelmed with the size of it. We've had a question around sort of why might, I guess these are like the snowy white peaks, I think is the phrase that's being used quite a lot today. Yeah. So why would the snowy white peaks change what this person believes to be their sole purpose in keeping the uppity black brown folk in their place, while people like Patterson, Shipman et al. Can keep causing harm? And I think this is off the back of a comment around sort of some of the decisions that maybe the GMC have made around who gets struck off and who doesn't, and sort of, I guess, people not feeling super like they're confident in their decision making and the outcomes of those things. So yeah, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, undeniably, healthcare is founded in patriarchy and systemic oppression and racism. Like, let's not kid ourselves that it isn't. One of my favorite quotes is, coming from a surgeon, a lot of the narratives you hear are like, we can fix it, we can mend it, we just need to stick a band-aid on it or resuscitate it. Like, we love all those kind of metaphors, and I call tosh on all of that, right? Healthcare isn't broken, it was built that way. These organizations, but also not just these organizations, our organization, the NHS, was built around colonialism, and our country was built around these things. And so a big part of it, again, is to start to decolonialize the stuff we do on every level. So we need to stop using phrases like Caucasian. We need to stop using, so the classic example of like small but big fights we're having is in obstetrics and gynecology. There's something called the Sims speculum. It's named after an obstetrician who developed it by experimenting on Black women. It's named after him. All obstetricians use it. And he went out and he bought some Black women and he wrote broadly about how they don't feel pain like us because they're a different species. And he did awful, awful things. Now, I think it's not a lot to ask to go, yeah, we're not going to call that anymore. It doesn't need to be named after him. We can't do away with the fact it was developed. And the example I give is as a Jew, most of our understanding of genetics comes from the concentration camps, but we don't go to the Adolf Hitler school of genetics. We can't ignore the work. We can't, it would be disrespectful nearly to try and pretend that it wasn't done, it didn't happen, but we shouldn't celebrate it. It is about recognizing that there is both conscious and unconscious bias, and sometimes just out and out bloody racism at every strata of the work we do, whether it's maternity outcomes for women of color or the surgical exams. The one I sat yesterday, we have robust evidence that demonstrates that these exams have differential attainment. That if you are a woman, a person of color, or there's an intersectional aspect to it as well, you will do less well in these exams. We have to recognize and admit that we are all part of these systems. And then again, we have to explicitly, consciously, with purpose and together say, well, how are we going to destruct it? Because you can't just burn it all down, right? Because then what? What you have to say is, right, looking at this undergraduate curriculum, there's loads of stuff here that alludes to transphobia, that alludes to racism, and we're going to take that out, and we're going to take that out, and we're going to replace it with this, and we're going to modify it with that. And again, that work takes time, but this is systems change, and therefore it really does take a broad stakeholder base to go, well, what do we replace it with? What does the future look like? Because otherwise what you get is the snowy white peaks. You get a room full of male, pale and stale going, I think I know what the future should look like. And what they do is they take out some bits that they think are the right bits and replace it with something that's normally very, very similar. And, you know, and so a big part of it again is chipping away at the people that are in those rooms, chipping away at the people who are making those decisions, but recognizing that all of us, every single one of us, have a role to play. And we see it with the GMC. The GMC are still making some pretty poor decisions, but it took us long enough to get them to admit, and they have, that they have a problem with racism.
Yeah. And that, I think, is a really powerful point to round us up on there, Simon. Thank you so much for today. And we're getting lots of comments in the chat saying this has been really, really helpful, really interesting. I think, you know, we started out talking very much about the sort of your personal experiences and getting into this work, and have very quickly, understandably, when talking about cultural transformation, ended up looking at the much bigger picture and all of the different challenges that we face in the organisation in order to level playing fields and to address, you know, historical violences that have happened to people's eugenics, and thinking about, you know, these things matter in terms of who gets to bring up bullying and harassment, who is able to help address these issues. So yeah, really interesting, really grateful to have you here. If you've been enjoying today's session, please do sort of tweet and share your thoughts, your insights, your takeaways from today's session. We've got an incredible community amongst NHS employees and leaders who across, like Twitter, as Simon's already mentioned. So please follow us at UK Culture Shift on Twitter, and let's carry on the conversation, because unfortunately we have reached time. My colleague Holly has popped in the chat as well that we've got a number of other online events coming up, including our next webinar on the 16th of November about the realities of bullying and harassment in the workplace and how to report it, and another online session around how we use this freedom to speak up guardians to support anonymous disclosures in your trusts. So thank you so much for coming. And if you would like to get in touch with us about our reporting platform or any further information, please see our new partnerships team. Their details, I believe, are being put in the chat as well. And please book in some time to have a conversation with them about how we can maybe help your organisation. But whatever you do next, best of luck with it. And thank you again so much, Simon, for joining us today. It's been really insightful. And have a good rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you very much for having me.